Okay. So I'll start out with asking, around what age did you learn about the internet?
I learned about the internet probably I was in my, probably, it was 1990, probably around my late 30s or early 40s.
Okay. So how did you find research for school, like when you had to do papers or assignments?
Good question. It was the quote-unquote old-fashioned way. I still remember in my undergrad program going to the library and just going through, at that time, which were just paper card catalogs, searching by subject, and then going to the stacks, seeing what was there, browsing through the books that were there, seeing if they would be useful for a paper and so on. And I did this very regularly. One image that comes to my mind is I went to school at Notre Dame, and they have cold, snowy winters usually. And I still remember lugging back to my dorm room about 8 books that I had checked out because I had found them in the card catalog through the snow and cold of about 10 degrees above zero. So it was a long trek.
Yeah. How long did it usually take to get all your information together?
Usually for papers, like if it was like a 5 or 10 page paper, it would probably take me 2 or 3 trips to the library, and then kind of going through the books and any periodicals that I had found. That would be another, I would say, another 10 to 12 hours. So putting all the elements together in order to be able to write the paper was probably about 13 to 15 hours of work.
Okay. How did your parents get in touch with you when you were out?
I'm sorry, how did the parents
get in touch with you when you were out?
Good question. It was telephone and letter. I would call, or they would call me on Sundays, and we would talk on the phone. Each dorm room at that time had a phone in the room rather than having to use a payphone on the wall of the hallway. And then letters. My mom was a wonderful letter writer, and she would write faithfully every week to me, type it out, and mail it to me. And I always look very much forward to seeing that in my mailbox.
Oh, that's sweet. Did you have a pager, and if so, how did they work?
Never have had one.
Never
have had a pager.
Okay.
Once the internet began working, and only within the past 2 years have I really even used text that much. But nope, never had a pager.
Okay. Was it hard for you to learn about the internet and get used to it?
It's a good question. It was initially hard, but once I realized how the World Wide Web was structured and how the various elements of websites were defined, then I began to feel very comfortable using it. But then I began to realize that it was limited, that I had to be very careful what I searched for, like on Google and others, in order not to miss information that I should. And then just very recently, I've been studying about the dark web, as it's called, and the fact that the World Wide Web, the URLs that we have, the www as the beginning, that's only a portion of what's available on the internet. And the dark web can have literally some very negative things going on in there. But so it was a little bit difficult to try to understand. Then I began to understand it, and I have used and used it a lot, but I don't intend to really move into the dark web. So it's been a learning process, but now I really enjoy the process. But part of me also goes back to looking at books in the library that I did when I was an undergrad. And what I've found is that I feel like I'm more researched and more have done more extensive thinking if I'm able to do both library work still today over at Holy Spirit Library and the internet Google search.
Okay. Did your parents learn about the internet?
my mom really never got into it very much. She used the typewriter to write her letters still, but my dad got very involved with it, and that was because my younger brother was very involved with Apple and Macs, and so my dad got an early Mac computer and kind of taught himself about the internet. Looked at a couple books, studied it, and then accessed it. Never talked with him very much about what he accessed, but that was his entrance into computers and the internet, and he used it quite extensively in the last 5 to 8 years of his life.
Okay, was it hard for him to learn about it? Or?
It was. He was a chemical engineer by trade, so he had a good analytical mind, but what the internet was so much different for him from when he was growing up, like in high school and college, which would have been in the 30s and early 40s, that it took longer for him to get acclimated to it compared to me. It took me a while, but I got acclimated. He got acclimated, but it took that much longer because it was that much more foreign to him.
With news, how long did you guys ever learn about national news, or was it just mainly?
Good. It was primarily national. That was the focus. When I was in my early teens, of course, there wasn't any internet. There wasn't any computers per se, although there were the major big mainframes that companies had and organizations had. But my source of news, both national and international, were the 3 network, ABC, NBC, CBS news programs in the evening, and then the newspaper. And my folks were faithful readers of our local newspaper. And my dad really began in the last 5 years of his life to look in the web for news stories, either accessing papers that had had sites on the web, or looking for other sources as well. My dad used it back in the late 50s into the 60s, early 70s, he subscribed to something called Facts on File, and they would send him monthly reports of major stories throughout the world, but they deliberately took out any type of opinion about it and tried to present it strictly as facts, much as an objective journalist has tried to do over the years. And he really enjoyed that. He felt he was learning about things and being able to make up his own mind about whether they were good or bad, right or wrong, and so on. And I got into the habit of reading the facts and figures as well as reading the local paper. But for my parents, the local newspaper and the network news shows were the key news providers.
Okay. Do you like the internet?
I do. I like it because of its speed. I like it because of the extent of things that you can access and it can give you. But I really am very skeptical of its overall goodness, because I think speed sometimes eliminates thoughtful reflection, and I think the range of materials can be overwhelming mentally, and it can also mislead a person into thinking they know a lot about something, whereas they only know a portion of it. Part of what I always think when I go to Google nowadays is, boy, you put in like what we study, like Freddie Gray, and all of a sudden you get 10,000 hits, in less than a second. Well, how do you go through those and make sense of it? Number one, but number two, I guess, is when I see the extent to which the Google's there, I have to remember that everything in those 10,000 listings, somebody had inputted into the internet in order for me, when I clicked and searched on Google, for that to come up. So I wonder about how many people actually do the inputting of the material that we then find on Google. It's kind of overwhelming to think about how much there can be that people's knowledge are going into the internet.
Yeah. Do you think that the news is more misleading now than it was before because of the false news that people put out?
Good question. I think yes. I think that's becoming more and more of a problem. The fake news ideas, but I also have come to believe that. Well, the fake news is a major problem. I tend to be a positive person. I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt and think they are working on something that's good. And most people, I think, are, but there are enough people that you can, without realizing it, access, who are really trying to position something or fool someone or have the fake news. So I think that it is becoming more and more dangerous, actually, because more and more people are moving away from high ethics or good ethics and providing materials that can be misleading. And I don't know that I answered your question. Could you say the question again?
Do you think that the internet is creating people to mislead things?
That's right. And I think the internet does mislead, but it also is accurate and factual. And I think right now that accurate and factual is significantly more than the misleading. So I think we're doing good, but I worry if that might not get worse over the next 5-10 years. Maybe not in my lifetime because I'm old, but in your lifetime, definitely. Don't have to be cynical, but be very skeptical. And that's kind of what we studied in 101. Be skeptical because it's going to be important to you and to your family, to the world, to be able to differentiate between the false news and what's really good news.
Okay. And do you miss how life was before the internet?
It's a good question. I love the speed that I find with Google and others in the internet, communications too. Social media, I'm getting more used to. Social media is a real plus in many ways. But I do miss the old way. I love to have books and look through them, and I really feel, and some research has kind of said this seems to be true, that having a book that you touch and that you page through and that's formatted in a certain way actually changes how your mind and your brain interacts with that knowledge. So I think that we are changing cognitively by the use of computers and the internet, and I do miss the way that I remember just getting a biggest kick out of the book and the text of the touch, the tactileness of the book, and kind of thinking to myself, okay, somebody sat down and really wrote this out, and I think about them more so than what I think about the internet and whoever wrote out what I read there. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I do miss some elements. I like the speed. I like the extent. I like the fact I don't have to walk through a snowstorm in order to bring books home from the library. But at the same time, I do miss I do miss actually the form of the book. There's a communication theorist from the 50s named Marshall McLuhan, and he said the medium is the message. And part of how I interpreted that is, and this was before the internet, I interpreted that was, whether somebody writes a letter or writes a book, how the medium itself tells a story. And I think if he were alive today and applying that same theory to the internet, he would have a lot to say about how electronics on a screen have affected the message, let alone what we actually write about in it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, those are all the questions.
Okay, I hope I've helped. If I can clarify anything or answer any more, please feel free to contact me, okay?